The winter wind screamed across the Rocky Mountains that December morning, driving snow through every crack in the log walls. Inside the trading post at Fort Bridger, Wyoming Territory, a heated argument was underway that would eventually change how thousands of trappers and settlers survived the brutal mountain winters. The year was 1847, and a grizzled trapper fresh down from the high country was explaining something that made no sense to anyone listening. He'd spent the previous winter in a cabin he'd built near the headwaters of the Green River, and he'd done something with his stove that violated every principle of common sense that frontier builders had followed for generations. He'd put it in the dead center of his one-room cabin, not against the back wall where the chimney could run straight up through the roof. Not in the corner where it would be out of the way. Right in the middle of the floor, where a man had to walk around it to get anywhere, where it ate up precious living space, where it seemed to serve no purpose except to be a nuisance. The other trappers laughed. One called him soft in the head. Another suggested the altitude had affected his thinking. But the man who'd spent that winter in the mountains wasn't laughing. He was alive, which was more than could be said for 3 other trappers who'd wintered in nearby valleys that year. And he'd burned half the firewood any of them would have expected. This is the story of how that unconventional placement, combined with techniques that seemed completely backward to experienced frontiersmen, created a heating system so effective it eventually spread across the entire Rocky Mountain fur trade region. But to understand why it worked and why it took someone willing to break all the rules to discover it, we need to understand just how brutally inadequate most frontier heating was and how desperate the situation had become by the mid-1840s. The American mountain man era reached its peak between 1825 and 1840, when thousands of trappers spread across the Rockies, hunting beaver for the international fur trade. These men lived in conditions that would kill most modern Americans within days. Winter temperatures in the high valleys routinely dropped to 20 or 30 below zero. Winds that could knock a grown man off his feet howled for days without stopping. Snow piled 8, 10, 12 feet deep. A trapper's cabin was typically a rough structure thrown together in late summer or early fall before the killing weather arrived. Most measured no more than 12 feet by 14 feet. Logs were notched at the corners and chinked with mud mixed with grass. The roof was usually pole rafters covered with bark and sod. One small window covered with greased paper or scraped hide. A door hung on leather hinges. Dirt floor packed hard by use. And somewhere in this space, usually against one wall, sat a cast-iron stove or a stone fireplace. The typical arrangement placed the heating source against the back wall, opposite the door. The chimney ran straight up through the roof, which meant minimal horizontal stovepipe that could leak smoke or catch fire. This placement left most of the cabin floor clear for a rough bed, a table made from split logs, maybe a stool or two. It's what everyone did because it's what made sense. The stove was dangerous. It needed clearance from walls, and putting it against one wall instead of in the middle meant you lost less usable space. But this conventional arrangement had problems that killed people every winter, and by the 1840s, those problems were getting worse. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was in decline. Beaver were trapped out in many areas. Silk hats were replacing felt hats in European fashion, destroying the market. Trappers who once moved camp every season, following the beaver, were now trying to extract the last value from marginal territory. That meant staying in one place longer, enduring full winters in high-altitude cabins that had originally been intended as temporary shelters. These extended winter stays exposed the flaws in traditional cabin heating with brutal clarity. A stove placed against the wall radiated heat in all directions, but half that heat went straight into the wall behind it. The logs absorbed some of it, but much of it simply conducted through to the outside air and was lost. The heat that did enter the room rose immediately to the ceiling, where it pooled uselessly in the rafters while the floor remained frozen. Temperature gradients in these cabins were extreme. A man might have his face burning from the stove's radiant heat, while his feet froze in boots that never completely thawed from November to April. The air near the ceiling could be uncomfortably hot, while the air at floor level remained well below freezing. Ice formed on the inside of walls. Water in buckets froze solid despite the roaring fire just feet away. Men woke in the morning to find frost on their beards from their own breath. Fuel consumption was staggering. A cabin with a wall-mounted stove might burn 4 to 6 cords of wood per month during deep winter. Cutting, hauling, and splitting that much wood in mountain winter conditions was exhausting work that took hours every day. Many trappers spent more time gathering fuel than they did on their actual work. The traditional solution to cold spots in the cabin was to build the fire hotter. But hotter fires consumed more wood, dried out the air to the point where men's skin cracked and bled, created such intense heat near the stove that it was impossible to sit close to it, and sent most of the heat straight up the chimney where it did no good whatsoever. Men died from this inefficiency, not directly from freezing, though that happened too, but from the exhaustion of constantly gathering wood, from injuries sustained while cutting timber in dangerous conditions, from pneumonia contracted during the temperature swings between working outside in bitter cold and returning to an overheated cabin, from smoke inhalation when desperate men choked down the chimney draft to try to keep heat in the room, from carbon monoxide poisoning when men sealed cabins too tightly trying to conserve heat. By the winter of 1846-47, the situation had reached a crisis point in certain areas. The easily accessible timber near many established camps had been cut years earlier. Trappers were traveling farther and farther to find adequate firewood, sometimes snowshoeing 2 or 3 miles each way, while hauling loads that might last only 2 or 3 days. The work was killing them. That was the situation facing the man who would make the discovery, a trapper who'd worked the beaver streams for nearly 15 years by that point. His name has been lost to history, appearing in no journals or letters that survived, mentioned in no newspaper accounts. We know of him only through second- and third-hand reports, through stories told by other mountain men who saw his cabin or heard about his techniques. What we do know is that he built his cabin in a small valley near the Green River headwaters in the fall of 1846, and he built it wrong, or so everyone thought. The conventional wisdom said, put the stove against the wall. He put it in the center of the room. The conventional wisdom said, build it on the dirt floor. He built a platform of flat stones about 8 inches high and placed the stove on top of that. The conventional wisdom said, keep the stove clear of any obstructions. He built a careful arrangement of large rocks around 3 sides of the stove, leaving only the loading door accessible. To the few other trappers who saw the setup before winter closed in, it looked like the work of a man who didn't know what he was doing. The center placement was baffling. The elevated platform seemed pointless, just more work for no benefit. The rocks around looked dangerous, blocking the heat and creating a fire hazard with all that stone in direct contact with the hot metal. Nobody understood that they were looking at a revolutionary approach to heating, one that would eventually spread across the entire mountain region and save countless lives. But the man who built it understood something about heat that his contemporaries had never grasped. Heat moves in 3 ways. It radiates directly from a hot surface to a cooler surface, like the warmth you feel standing near a bonfire. It conducts through materials, traveling from hot areas to cold areas through direct contact. And it convects, carried by moving air that rises when heated and sinks when cooled, creating circulation patterns. The standard wall-mounted stove relied primarily on radiation. Heat radiated from the hot iron into the room, and that was supposed to warm the space. But radiation has a critical limitation. It travels in straight lines. Heat radiating from a stove travels until it hits something, and then it stops. If what it hits is a wall, that heat goes into the wall, and much of it conducts right through to the outside. The people in the cabin only benefit from the heat radiating into the open room, which is half or less of the total heat the stove produces. The trapper who built his cabin on the Green River understood this instinctively. He'd spent years watching how heat moved in various shelters. He'd noticed that a campfire in the open, with no walls to block the heat, somehow seemed more efficient at warming people sitting around it than a stove in a cabin, despite producing far less total heat. He'd observed that large rocks placed in the fire stayed hot for hours after the flames died. He'd felt how heat rose from a fire and wondered why cabin designers were content to let it pool uselessly in the rafters. His center-place stove wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated design that maximized every principle of heat transfer he'd observed. By placing the stove in the center of the room, he ensured that heat radiated in all directions into open space. Nothing blocked it. No wall absorbed it before it could warm the room. The heat traveled outward in every direction until it reached the cabin walls, which were 12 or 14 feet away instead of 2 or 3 feet away. That meant the heat had to travel through much more air before hitting a surface it could conduct through, and air is an excellent insulator. The longer the heat stayed in the room before reaching a wall, the more of it got absorbed by the air and the objects in the cabin. But the center placement created an obvious problem. How do you run a chimney from the center of the room to the peak of the roof without creating a massive fire hazard? The stovepipe would have to run 10 or 12 feet horizontally before it could turn upward, and that much horizontal pipe would accumulate dangerous amounts of creosote, lose significant heat to the room, and create draft problems. This is where the elevated platform came in. By raising the stove 8 inches on a stone platform, the trapper created room for the stovepipe to exit horizontally at about knee height. The pipe ran straight from the back of the stove to the nearest wall, supported by wire hangers from the ceiling. At the wall, it turned 90 degrees and went straight up through the roof. That 8 or 9 feet of horizontal stovepipe, which conventional wisdom said was dangerous and inefficient, turned out to be one of the most important elements of the system. Every foot of that pipe was radiating heat directly into the room instead of sending it outside. The pipe surface reached temperatures of 300 to 400 degrees, and all that heat radiated into the living space. The elevated position put the pipe at about the same height as a man's torso when standing, which meant the heat radiated right into the most comfortable zone. The draft concerns that conventional builders worried about turned out to be minimal. The stove pulled enough air to create adequate draft through 8 feet of horizontal pipe without any problems, especially since the vertical section above that point was quite tall, creating strong draw. The creosote accumulation that was supposed to be such a hazard also proved manageable. Yes, the horizontal pipe accumulated more creosote than a vertical pipe would. But that creosote accumulated where it could be easily inspected and cleaned, not high up in a dangerous vertical chimney section. A man could simply disconnect the horizontal pipe sections a few times during the winter and scrape them clean. This took perhaps an hour's work and actually made maintenance safer and easier than trying to clean a tall vertical chimney section. The real genius of the system, though, was the rocks around. Those stones that looked so pointless to visiting trappers were solving the biggest problem with cast iron stoves: temperature swings and wasted heat. Cast iron stoves heat up quickly and cool down quickly. When you load them with wood and get a fire going, they can reach surface temperatures of 500 or 600 degrees within 15 or 20 minutes. They radiate intense heat that can be uncomfortable to sit near. Then, as the fire dies down between loadings, they cool rapidly. Within an hour of the fire going out, the stove surface is barely warm. The temperature in the cabin swings wildly through these cycles. The rocks around transformed this rapid cycle system into a slow, steady heat source. The rocks absorbed heat from the stove and stored it. Rock, especially dense granite or sandstone, has high thermal mass. This means it takes a lot of heat energy to raise the temperature of rock, But once heated, rock releases that energy slowly over many hours. The arrangement around this particular stove consisted of flat rocks about 4 inches thick, stacked too high on 3 sides of the stove. The total mass of rock was probably 400 or 500 pounds. That rock mass acted like a thermal battery, absorbing heat when the fire was burning hot and releasing it slowly when the fire died down. The effect on cabin temperature was dramatic. Instead of wild swings from too hot to too cold, the temperature remained relatively stable. When the fire was loaded and burning hard, the stove surface got extremely hot. But the surrounding rocks absorbed much of that intense heat before it could make the nearby area uncomfortable. The rocks heated slowly, reaching peak temperatures of perhaps 150 to 200 degrees. As the fire died down and the stove cooled, the rocks continued radiating steady heat into the cabin for hours. This meant that instead of having to reload the stove every 2 or 3 hours to maintain temperature, the trapper could load it every 6 or 8 hours and still keep the cabin comfortable. The rock mass evened out the heating cycles, maintaining temperature through the night without constant attention. The fuel savings were extraordinary. Where a conventional wall-mounted stove might burn 4 to 6 cords of wood per month, this center-place system, with its rock surround, burned 2 to 3 cords. That reduced the firewood gathering work by more than half. In mountain winter conditions, where every cord of wood represented many hours of dangerous, exhausting labor, that reduction was the difference between barely surviving and living in relative comfort. There were other benefits that only became apparent over the course of that first winter. The elevated stove platform meant that loading the fire was more comfortable. A man didn't have to bend down to floor level to feed wood into the stove. The 8-inch elevation brought the firebox to a much more comfortable working height. This seems like a minor detail until you consider that in a cold climate cabin, you're loading that stove perhaps 6 to 10 times per day, every day for months. Hundreds of repetitions of bending down to floor level create back strain and fatigue. The elevated position eliminated that problem. The center placement created natural air circulation patterns that dramatically improved overall cabin comfort. Heat rises, and in a conventional cabin with a wall-mounted stove, that rising heat flowed straight up to the ceiling and stayed there. The peak of the cabin might be 80 or 90 degrees, while the floor remained below freezing. With a center-mounted stove, the rising heat had room to spread in all directions as it rose. It created circulation patterns that moved warm air throughout the entire cabin volume instead of channeling it straight up in one location. The heated air rising from the center stove reached the ceiling and spread outward toward all the walls. As it cooled slightly, it descended along the walls and flowed back toward the center at floor level, where it was reheated and rose again. This natural convection cycle meant that cold spots were eliminated. The floor stayed warmer. The far corners of the cabin stayed warmer. The entire volume reached a more uniform temperature. The trapper discovered another advantage entirely by accident. On extremely cold nights, when temperatures dropped to 30 or 40 below zero outside, he found he could heat rocks on top of the stove and then place them on his sleeping platform for the night. A large, flat rock, heated to perhaps 200 degrees and wrapped in an old blanket, would stay warm enough to keep his feet comfortable for 6 or 7 hours. This meant he could let the fire die down overnight without waking up with frozen feet, something that had plagued him in previous winters. That first winter, the trapper cut approximately 2.5 cords of wood to heat his cabin from November through March. Trappers in nearby valleys using conventional wall-mounted stoves burned anywhere from 12 to 20 cords for the same period. The difference was so dramatic that when he descended to Fort Bridger in late March to sell his winter's catch, nobody believed him at first. He'd brought 3 large beaver plues with him, specifically to demonstrate his heating system. Not beaver furs for selling, but 3 of the flattest, best-shaped rocks from his cabin surround, each weighing perhaps 30 pounds. At the trading post, with a crowd of skeptical trappers watching, he had them build up a hot fire in the post's wall-mounted stove. He placed all 3 rocks directly on the stove surface and let them heat for 2 hours. Then he wrapped each rock in a wool blanket and placed them on the floor in different locations around the trading post. He asked the trappers to put their hands on the blankets and feel the warmth. The rocks were still radiating significant heat 3 hours after being removed from the stove. One trapper, more curious than skeptical, left one rock wrapped in its blanket overnight. In the morning, more than 12 hours later, it was still noticeably warm to the touch. This demonstration convinced the doubters. Rock could store heat, a lot of heat, and it would release that heat slowly over many hours. The implications were obvious. Build enough rock mass around a stove, and you could even out the temperature swings, reduce fuel consumption, and improve overall comfort. By the summer of 1847, word of the technique had spread through the mountain man community. That fall, several trappers built new cabins or modified existing ones to incorporate center-place stoves with rock surrounds. The results confirmed what the original experimenter had discovered. Fuel consumption dropped dramatically. Cabin temperatures stayed more stable. The constant work of wood gathering was reduced to manageable levels. But the technique didn't spread as quickly as it should have. The mountain man era was ending. The beaver trade was collapsing. By 1850, most of the trappers had moved on to other pursuits or other regions. The center-place stove technique, which had been developing among a small group of trappers in the Rockies, might have died out entirely if settlers hadn't started moving into the same territory. The Great Western Migration of the 1840s and 1850s brought tens of thousands of settlers across the plains and into the mountains. Many of these people knew nothing about surviving mountain winters. They built cabins using techniques from back east, techniques that worked fine in Missouri or Ohio, but were completely inadequate in Wyoming or Montana. Their first winters were brutal. Settlers burned through their entire winter wood supply by January and faced 2 more months of killing cold with no fuel. Children developed frostbite inside their own cabins. Adults suffered from constant respiratory infections caused by the temperature extremes and poor air quality from smoking fires. This is where the old trappers who'd stayed in the mountains became valuable. A few of them, men who'd learned the center stove technique during the final years of the fur trade, began working as consultants, helping settlers modify their cabins or build new ones using the improved heating system. One such man, working in the South Pass area of Wyoming Territory in 1853, helped more than 20 families convert their wall-mounted stoves to center-place systems with rock surrounds. The improvements were so dramatic that word spread down the immigrant trail. Settlers who'd been planning to move on to Oregon or California decided to winter over and have their cabins converted before attempting to continue west. The technique began to evolve as more people experimented with it. Some builders discovered that using 2 different types of stone could improve performance. Dense granite or sandstone for the inner layer, closest to the stove, because these materials could withstand the intense heat without cracking. Then a second, outer layer of limestone or other sedimentary rock, which had slightly lower heat tolerance but better thermal mass per pound. The 2-layer system captured and stored heat more efficiently than single-layer systems. Others experimented with the amount of rock. Too little, and the thermal mass effect was minimal. Too much, and it took so long to heat the rock mass that the cabin stayed cold for hours after starting a fire. Through trial and error, builders settled on an optimal mass of about 400 to 600 pounds of rock for a 12 by 14-foot cabin. This was enough mass to even out the temperature swings, but not so much that it created problematic heat sink effects during fire starting. The height of the rock surround also went through several iterations. Early versions, including the original, stacked rocks to about the same height as the stove, maybe 16 to 18 inches total. But some builders experimented with taller surrounds, going up to 3 feet or even higher. These taller surrounds stored more heat, but they also blocked more of the direct radiant heat from reaching the room. The consensus eventually settled on surrounds about 2 feet high, which balanced thermal mass storage with direct radiation. The most controversial aspect of the center placement remained the space it consumed. In a 12 by 14-foot cabin, putting the stove and its rocks around in the center meant losing a significant amount of floor space. You had to walk around it constantly. It divided the cabin into awkward sections. It complicated furniture placement, but the fuel savings were so dramatic that most people accepted the inconvenience. Spending 30% of your time walking around a stove was a small price to pay for cutting your firewood requirements in half. And many builders found that the rocks around itself became useful space. The rocks on top stayed warm enough that you could dry clothes on them, warm food, heat water for washing, all without having to carefully monitor temperatures the way you would placing items directly on a hot stove. One innovation that emerged around 1855 was the addition of a flat, smooth stone cap on top of the rock surround. Instead of leaving the top surfaces irregular, builders would find or cut flat stones to create a level surface about 6 inches wide, running around the top of the surround. This created a warm shelf at about waist height, where you could place items for drying or warming. The shelf also gave you a comfortable surface to lean against while feeding the fire or tending the stove. By 1860, the center-placed stove with rocks around had become common in mountain cabins throughout the Rockies and into the Sierra Nevada. But it remained largely unknown in the eastern states and even in many western settlements that didn't have severe winter conditions. The technique developed and spread through an informal network of mountain people who directly experienced its benefits and shared information through personal contact and practical demonstration. The Civil War interrupted the westward expansion and the spread of frontier innovations. For 4 years, the mountain territories saw little new settlement. The center stove technique continued to be used and refined by existing residents, but it didn't spread to new areas. After the war, a new wave of settlement brought different heating technologies. Coal became more available as railroads pushed west. Factory-made stoves improved significantly. The Franklin stove, which had been the dominant technology in the 1840s and 1850s, was replaced by more efficient designs with built-in baffles, better draft control, and improved heat radiation. These new stoves reduced the fuel efficiency gap between center and wall placement. But in remote mountain areas where modern manufactured stoves were expensive or unavailable, and where coal was not an option, the center-placed stove with rocks around remained the heating method of choice well into the 1870s and even beyond. Rangers and homesteaders building cabins in high elevation areas continued to use the technique because it worked. It was simple, and it required no manufactured components except the stove itself. The physics principles that made the system work were not well understood by the frontiersmen who used it. They knew it worked because they could measure the results in cords of wood saved and in cabin comfort. But they couldn't explain in modern terms why it worked. They didn't talk about thermal mass or convection currents or radiant heat transfer. They just knew that rocks around a stove stored warmth and that a stove in the center of a room heated more evenly than one against a wall. The specific heat capacity of rock is about 0.84 joules per gram per degree Celsius. This means it takes almost 1 joule of energy to raise 1 gram of rock by 1 degree. A 400-pound rock surround, which is approximately 180,000 grams, stores roughly 150,000 joules of heat energy when heated from room temperature to 200 degrees. That's equivalent to about 140 BTUs, or about the amount of energy in 1.5 pounds of firewood, except the rock releases that energy over 8 or 10 hours instead of burning in 10 minutes. The elevated stove position created another thermal advantage that frontier builders probably didn't fully understand. Cold air is denser than warm air, so it naturally sinks to floor level. In a cabin with a floor-level stove, the coldest air in the cabin is pooled right at the base of the heating source, which is the worst possible arrangement. The cold air absorbs heat from the stove base and floor, but then it just stays there being cold, unable to rise and circulate until it's warmed sufficiently. With an elevated stove, the coldest air can circulate underneath the stove and platform, where it's warmed by heat radiating down from the stove bottom, and by conduction from the heated stone platform. This pre-warms the air before it reaches the level of the main firebox, making the entire heating cycle more efficient. The constant circulation of cold air underneath and warm air rising from above creates a natural thermal siphon effect that moves air through the cabin without any mechanical assistance. The horizontal stovepipe section, which seems so wrong to conventional builders, was actually one of the most efficient heat exchangers in the entire system. Stovepipe radiates heat much more effectively than cast iron stove bodies because the pipe has thinner walls and a much higher surface area to volume ratio. An 8-foot section of 6-inch stovepipe has about 12 square feet of surface area, all of it at 300 to 400 degrees, all of it radiating directly into the room. That's equivalent to adding a substantial radiator to the heating system, capturing heat that would otherwise go straight up the chimney. Modern measurements suggest that the horizontal stovepipe section could capture and radiate into the room about 30% of the heat that would otherwise be lost up the chimney. This essentially recovered waste heat and put it to use, a principle that wouldn't be formally incorporated into heating system design until the development of heat recovery ventilators more than a century later. The practical benefits of the system showed up in unexpected ways. Trappers and settlers who used center-placed stoves with rock surrounds reported fewer respiratory problems during winter months. The more stable temperatures meant less stress on the respiratory system from constant adaptation to extreme swings. The reduced smoke, because the system could operate efficiently at lower firing rates, meant better air quality. The elevated stove position put the firebox at about the same height as a seated person's breathing zone, which somehow seemed to reduce drafts at floor level that could carry dust and debris into the air. Food storage improved because there were fewer freeze-thaw cycles. In a cabin heated by a wall-mounted stove with wild temperature swings, food stored near walls would partially freeze overnight and thaw during the day. This cycle promoted spoilage. With the more stable temperatures from a center stove system, food stayed at more consistent temperatures and lasted longer. Clothes dried faster and more completely. The warm rocks provided an ideal drying surface at a comfortable working height. Wet wool garments, which could take days to dry in a cold, damp cabin, would dry overnight on the rocks around. This reduced the moisture in the cabin air and decreased the risk of mold and mildew. The technique even affected social patterns in mountain communities. A cabin with a center stove became a more comfortable gathering place because guests could sit in a circle around the heat source rather than crowding near one wall. The temperature was more uniform throughout the space, so people near the far wall weren't freezing while people near the stove were roasting. This made mountain cabins more viable as social spaces during the long winter months when isolation could become psychologically dangerous. By the 1880s, the mountain frontier was largely settled. Railroads had reached most areas. Manufactured goods, including efficient coal stoves, became widely available. The center-placed wood stove with rocks around began to fade from use, replaced by newer technologies that offered greater convenience even if they weren't significantly more fuel efficient. But in some areas, particularly in very remote locations where modern conveniences were slow to arrive, the technique persisted into the early 20th century. Forest rangers building remote cabins in the 1910s and 1920s sometimes used center-placed stoves because the old-timers they consulted recommended the design. Some hunting and fishing lodges in the Rockies, built in the 1920s and 1930s, incorporated variations of the rocks-around technique for aesthetic reasons as much as practical ones, creating dramatic stone features around central fireplaces. The technique was largely forgotten by the mid-20th century. With rural electrification, propane distribution, and modern insulation materials, the fuel efficiency advantage disappeared. Center placement was now just an inconvenience with no offsetting benefit. The rock surround became a quaint architectural feature rather than a functional necessity. Interest in the technique revived slightly during the back-to-the-land movement of the 1970s, when people building off-grid cabins researched historical heating methods. Some modern wood stove installations, particularly in vacation cabins and hunting lodges, deliberately incorporate aspects of the old mountain man technique. Large stone or masonry features behind or around wood stoves serve both aesthetic and functional purposes. Some builders have rediscovered that elevated stoves with horizontal flue runs can indeed improve heating efficiency, though modern building codes often restrict or prohibit such installations due to creosote fire concerns. The original innovation, the center-place stove that seemed so wrong to every experienced builder who first saw it, turned out to be profoundly right for specific conditions and constraints. It solved real problems that were killing people. It reduced backbreaking labor to manageable levels. It made frontier life slightly less brutal, which in the mountains was the difference between survival and death. The trapper who first built that cabin on the Green River in 1846 probably never knew how far his innovation would spread. He was solving an immediate, practical problem with the materials and knowledge available to him. He observed how heat moved, he experimented with placement and mass, he tested different configurations, and he found something that worked better than what everyone else was doing. That's the essence of real innovation. It's not about following established practices or doing what everyone says is correct. It's about understanding the actual problem you're trying to solve, observing how things actually work, rather than how they're supposed to work, and having the courage to try something different even when everyone tells you you're wrong. The center-place stove was wrong by every conventional standard. It wasted space. It created obstacles. It complicated chimney routing. It violated established building practices. But in the specific context of a mountain winter cabin heated by wood, with severe fuel gathering constraints and life-threatening cold, it was exactly right. The trapper who built it understood something fundamental. Convention is optimized for the average case, but survival often demands optimization for the specific case. In the high mountain valleys where wood was scarce, winters were brutal, and every cord of firewood represented dangerous, exhausting work. The center-place stove with its rock surround cut fuel requirements in half. That wasn't a minor improvement. That was the difference between a barely survivable winter and a winter where you had time and energy for other things besides gathering wood. It meant the difference between chronic exhaustion that left you vulnerable to sickness and injury and maintaining the margin of strength you needed to make it through to spring. The technique worked because it addressed the actual physics of heat transfer in a small, poorly insulated space, radiation from all sides instead of just half, thermal mass to even out temperature swings, natural convection to circulate air throughout the space. Heat recovery from what would otherwise be wasted chimney heat. Elevated position to optimize air circulation. Every element of the design solved a specific problem with the conventional approach. Today, we understand the physics. We can calculate the BTUs stored in thermal mass. We can model the convection currents. We can quantify the efficiency gains. But we understand these things because people like that unknown trapper figured them out through observation and experiment long before anyone could explain why they worked. The story matters not because center-place stoves are some kind of forgotten heating solution we should all adopt. Modern heating is far superior in almost every way. The story matters because it illustrates how innovation actually happens. Someone faces a real problem in a specific context. They observe carefully how things work. They question whether the conventional solution is really optimal. They're willing to try something that looks wrong to everyone else. And they persist through the skepticism because they can see the results in front of them. That trapper cutting his winter fuel requirement from 6 cords to 3 didn't need anyone to tell him his system worked. He could count the cords, he could feel the stable temperature, he could see the reduced labor and exhaustion. Those empirical results were more convincing than any amount of conventional wisdom saying it shouldn't work. The mountain man's wrong stove placement became the smartest idea, not because it revolutionized American heating technology. It didn't. It became smart because in a very specific time and place and set of circumstances, it solved a critical problem better than anything else available. It saved labor, improved comfort, and probably saved lives. For the men who used it during those years, that was more than enough.